I'm André Picard. I'm the health columnist at the Globe and Mail and the author of the new book, Neglected No More, The Urgent Need to Improve the Lives of Canada's Elders. And I'm ready to start digging deep.
I'm Mark Sutcliffe, and I'm on a quest to learn from the best. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books and Abacus Data. This is the latest in our series of one-on-one conversations with thoughtful, accomplished people from many different fields. On this episode, journalist and author André Picard on why we all need to pay way more attention to how we look after ourselves and how we care for the elderly in our society. So, André Picard never intended to be a reporter. He studied business in university, and he kind of fell into writing. And even then, he never intended to report on healthcare. But now, over a long career with the Globe and Mail, during which he's won many awards and honors, André has probably become the most respected and the most widely read healthcare journalist in Canada. And his new book is very timely. It's called Neglected No More: The Urgent Need to Improve the Lives of Canada's Elders in the Wake of a Pandemic. So it's no secret that the coronavirus crisis has exposed enormous cracks in long-term care facilities and retirement homes, and more generally, how we take care of the elderly in our society. In our conversation today, we're going to talk about why that has happened and what we need to do about it. But we're also going to get André's perspective on a wide range of other topics, including why we should stop accepting second-rate healthcare just because it's free, how our focus as individuals and as a society is way too much on sickness and not enough on health, why we have so many blind spots about our decisions and choices, why we're all in a state of denial about our own aging. And André has some very specific thoughts on what we can do to fix all of that. In fact, he's going to tell us exactly what he would do if he were in charge of the entire healthcare system. And he's going to share some great stories, including about how he fell into journalism because he loved music. Okay, one last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear on this podcast, please subscribe to it and post a review of Digging Deep on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and share it with your network. And if you're looking for more information on this episode, on the podcast in general, please go to letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. Now, let's start digging deep with healthcare journalist and author André Picard. André, it's great to welcome you to Digging Deep. I have followed your work for many, many years and admired what you do. You hold this very special place in our country, covering the healthcare beat, covering so many important issues we've encountered over the last 2 or 3 decades. And your new book is, I think, a critical contribution to a really important discussion. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's start by getting to know you a little bit. I think a lot of people know your work, but maybe don't know you quite so much. So looking back, what would you say is your fondest childhood memory?
I would definitely be playing hockey. I was raised in Northern Ontario where I was a rink rat, so I loved playing hockey indoors, outdoors, all the time.
Okay. And who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
Well, maybe not surprisingly, Guy Lafleur. Of course, I wore number 10.
Okay. Mine too, actually, when I was a kid. He grew up around Ottawa, of course, and played just on the other side of the Ottawa River from where I live. So it's not surprising for anybody growing up in the 70s, right? What did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
When I was a kid, I wanted to be a garbage man, believe it or not. And then when I got a little older in high school, I guess I was thinking of law. And then I guess some people would say I took a wrong turn, but I think I took a right turn.
Nice. Why a garbage man?
I don't know. My parents tell me that I used to push my father to follow around the garbage truck. I was sort of fascinated by the trucks and the equipment, and maybe I was just an early environmentalist. I'm not sure.
Okay. What would you say is your life story in 6 words?
I would say shy kid becomes outspoken adult.
Okay. What's your greatest mistake, or what's a big mistake that you've made somewhere along the way, and what did you learn from it?
Oh boy, I think I make mistakes every single day, kind of goes along with the business. I can't think of one that stands out. I'm kind of a no regrets guy, look forward rather than backwards. So I hope I learn from every mistake I make.
For what do you feel most grateful?
Oh, definitely for my children and for my health. No, nothing more important in life than those two things.
What's been the best year of your life so far, and why?
I guess I'd have to say 1996 and 1999. I can't pick between them because those are the years my kids were born. So I think those always stand out and always will.
And what's been the toughest year of your life so far?
I think without a doubt, 2020, 2021 has been really hard. It's been sort of rewarding professionally, but like many people, really hard personally, a really difficult year in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. And how have you been? I know you were already working from home anyway, right? So that part didn't change, but how else has it been challenging for you?
Yeah, my place of work didn't change, but I think just the volume of work, just the sort of the weight of the world on your shoulders, like a lot of people watching what you're writing and being, having so much pressure to get it right. I think that's difficult.
Yeah.
And then, and that carries over into your home life, just kind of becomes all consuming, this work sometimes.
Yeah. And I guess there would have been a shift to some extent in terms of the kinds of things you would have been covering that would have been with more of a long-term focus on healthcare policy and those kinds of things. Not always, but often, as opposed to everything you've covered in the last year, which has such an immediate kind of element to it, right?
Yeah, I like to say that I'm covering the exact same things I always have for the past 35 years or so, but they've just become more urgent and they've moved a lot up closer to the front of the newspaper. It's just become more timely. But I've actually been writing about these same issues for a long time.
What one person would you say has had the greatest impact on your life?
Probably my grandfather. Our family lived with my grandparents when I was young, and I think he had a really big influence on me.
And how so? Tell me more.
Just he was a very confident, jovial man who, always sent the message, just, do what right in life and do what you want, follow your passion. And I think that's what I ended up doing.
What is the most important lesson that you've learned that you would share with others?
I think, probably the lesson of journalism is always to be curious. And I think that serves everyone really well in life. And the other one that goes hand in hand that journalists, I think, sometimes forget is always be kind to. There's never a downside to being kind to people.
What would people be most surprised to learn about you?
I think maybe they'd be surprised that an old, rickety, bearded guy like me likes to run and runs a lot. So maybe that'd be a surprise.
Yeah, and we've spoken about running before, and you, for a time, I think you were running up Mount Royal every day, right, in Montreal. Is that right?
Yeah, you're one of the people who does know I'm a longtime runner. I do marathons and half marathons. I lived right beside Mount Royal for many, many years, so spent a lot of time there. These days, I have the pleasure of living right near Stanley Park, and I get to go out there every day, sort of a running heaven, as you know.
Yeah, that's a beautiful spot to run. I wish I could run there more often. What's your secret talent?
What's my secret talent? Maybe people would be surprised that I like beekeeping. So I was keeping bees for a long time. I'm not presently because I'm in an apartment, but I'd say that was my secret talent.
Okay, wow. We'll have to come back to that. I'm curious about how that arose. All right, what is the most fun you've ever had?
Fun. Let's see. I'm not a big party guy. My friends will all laugh at that question, but I'd say the most fun is when you're running and you just get in that zone where you just feel like you can run forever. Those rare moments where it just feels like the right thing to be doing. Those are the moments I think are the most fun. They're just impossible to replicate.
Yeah, that is a great feeling. What is the scariest thing you've ever done?
Well, I've done many scary things in my life as part of my journalism. I've been to war zones, I've been to coups, I've done all kinds of crazy things, natural disasters. So I think hard to pick one out. Maybe the time I spent many months in Rwanda during the genocide, I'd say that was probably a little bit, most people would consider that scary, I guess.
Mm-hmm. What's your boldest prediction for the future? And this obviously comes at an interesting time, and you have an interesting perspective because of the work you do.
I guess maybe this will surprise people because I'm a journalist too, but I think my boldest prediction would be that things aren't going to be as bad as we think. I think we, as humans, really figure things out in strange ways. I have lots of faith in the younger generation. I've been working a lot with students, teaching for a bit, and I think they're really going to get the act together. I think my generation has maybe flubbed things quite a bit, and I think younger people are gonna save us.
So do you think you're essentially an optimist?
I think you have to be an optimist if you write about health and if you write about public health. Otherwise, you'd be pretty depressed all the time. So yeah, I'm an optimist, and I'm especially optimistic about the younger generation that gets a lot of grief and doesn't get a lot of credit. I think they're really innovative and thoughtful, and they're going to do things differently.
I know that you've received a number of honorary degrees. If you were giving a commencement address today, what would be your message to students?
Yeah, I have done many commencement addresses. They all have little variations, but it's always the same thing. Just follow your heart. Don't worry about having a career. Don't worry about having a job. Find your passion in life, and things will work out. That's the best thing you can do, is follow your passion.
What's been a recent epiphany for you? Is there something about which you have changed your mind, or a recent discovery that you've made?
I don't know if it's an epiphany, but I recently turned 60, and I guess I discovered that there's still a lot of life ahead of you at 60. So I'm not sure that's an epiphany, but an important learning, if nothing else.
Okay. And other than your own books, what book are you most likely to recommend to others? Is there a book that's had a particular impact on you?
I would again recommend a book that I always loved reading to my children, Le Petit Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I think every life lesson is in that book. You can never go wrong reading that.
Okay, great stuff. All right. André, thank you so much for answering those questions. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we will continue digging deep with André Picard. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, but in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. Check out ZenBooks at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. Digging Deep is all about helping you make better decisions, and so is Abacus Data. Most leaders struggle to connect with and engage their audiences. Why is that? It's because they aren't sure how they think and feel and how they will react. Abacus Data can give you the strategic insights you need to make better decisions and to make them confidently. Here's a good example. A major national union was recently negotiating a new agreement for its thousands of members. This had the potential to be a very difficult process. There were many competing interests. So they brought in Abacus Data to conduct thorough and detailed research of their members to learn exactly where they stood, what they were thinking, what they wanted. And as a result, they were able to secure a strong new deal that was accepted overwhelmingly in a national vote. Abacus Data helps all of its clients understand what's really happening in the minds of their employees, clients, and stakeholders. They help them avoid costly blind spots. And they're really good at what they do. In fact, Abacus Data was one of the most accurate pollsters in the 2019 Canadian federal election. Make the one decision that will improve all of your other decisions. Let Abacus Data help you move forward with confidence and clarity. Go to abacusdata.ca. That's abacusdata.ca. André, again, thank you very much for being with us, and looking forward to talking about the content of your book and why we have this dynamic about, for many years now, not really properly looking after seniors in our society. It's a huge issue, and you delve so deeply into it with your book and with a lot of the other writing that you've done. But just to dig a little deeper into your background, I know you didn't originally want to be a journalist, right? That wasn't the plan initially when you went to university, right?
Yeah, no, not at all. I stumbled into it. I was actually studying business. I studied accounting, graduated in that, but one day wandered into a newspaper office. I'm a big music fan. I started reviewing records for the student newspaper, not to date myself, but we had records at that time. And that's when I started doing journalism. And because I had a business degree, I kind of got pulled into the business side of the paper, because student newspapers are always in perpetual financial trouble. Ended up being the editor, et cetera, and just kind of continued down that road from there.
Okay. And that was the Fulcrum, which is the newspaper at the University of Ottawa, right?
Yeah, I was the Fulcrum, University of Ottawa. I eventually ended up going to Carleton to study journalism.
Okay. But it's interesting because sometimes for people, they enroll in journalism and end up working at the student newspaper. You worked at the student newspaper, and that sparked your interest in journalism and caused you to pursue a journalism degree.
Yeah. So at the University of Ottawa, there is no journalism school. So it's just volunteers on the paper. But many of them have gone on to do interesting things. So,
and what kind of music were you into at that time?
I love all kinds of music, and I still to this day love all kinds of music. I guess I was more of a rock person back then, and new wave-ish was the thing in the late 70s. Still some hardcore rock, but things I still love to this day. I still had this huge record collection from those days until recently.
Okay, so walk me through kind of the path from there, because now you're into journalism, and you didn't necessarily set out to have this beat that you've had for the last few decades. But it's kind of an interesting path towards that, as I understand it, because you covered gay rights, you covered the AIDS crisis, you covered some of the protests around that, and that's sort of what led you into the healthcare space, right?
Yeah, so I talked earlier about serendipity, wandering into the paper, and that was the beginning of the era of AIDS, right? So in student newspapers, we're very activist, busybodies, got interested in the AIDS crisis. So we were writing about it in student newspapers long before didn't really become a big deal in the mainstream media for several years. It was seen as a marginalized, it's just gay men kind of thing, issue. And so just that's kind of been the arc of my career. I started writing about AIDS, and then when I went to the Globe, they're like, "Oh, you're young, you know something about this." I started covering it. The medical reporter at the time wasn't really interested. It was kind of an icky topic. I covered lots of protests, angry gay men throwing blood, etc., chanting, demanding drugs. Really fun stuff to do, but for the newspaper, not really big stories until it became a huge issue. And it became a huge issue when Rock Hudson died. Of all things, that sort of dragged it into the mainstream media, and I just happened to be at that intersection at the time. And probably the best thing about my career is the Globe was a very open-minded place and said, well, even though you're young, you can keep doing this. Even though you're not experienced, you might as well stick with this story. And I've stuck with it for almost 40 years now.
Yeah, and that, of course, led to you covering the tainted blood scandal, which is a huge scandal in Canada. And again, as we're going to talk about with regard to the crisis around long-term care and retirement homes and that sort of thing, an institutional crisis where there were just the system really let people down, didn't it?
Yeah. And that's, I think, again, another part of my career is I don't really write about medicine. I write about health, and I write about the intersection of health and politics. To me, health is fundamentally a really political issue. And so is medicine. And that's always this kind of the niche I've had, is writing about that policy stuff and trying to bring it to life, rather than writing about, these new drugs, et cetera. So that AIDS has lent itself perfectly to that. So does COVID and many infectious diseases in between.
When did you start to realize that you were basically a healthcare reporter and not, that was going to be your thing, that was going to be your beat, your passion, as opposed to being a journalist who happened to have a particular assignment in an area?
Yeah, I guess it came slowly. Like I've always done other stuff because I was not located in our head office in Toronto. I wasn't officially a beat reporter. We had these internal rules, union rules. So I did other stuff. I covered lots of Quebec politics. I wrote all kinds of things, the weekend crime beat, whatever. We all took turns doing things. But health was always sort of in the background, and gradually it just came more and more to the fore, especially as issues got larger. The AIDS issue became probably the biggest story in the world by the 90s. So there was a lot more to write about then.
And what have you learned about our approach to healthcare and how it all works? Because you've exposed lots of cracks in the healthcare system in how politics intersects with it, in terms of how institutional management comes into play. What are some of the themes that you've observed that apply kind of to many of the crises that you've covered?
I think probably the theme that's throughout all my work over the years is that we've got it upside down. We spend way too much money and time and effort on sickness care, waiting for people to get sick and then trying to patch them up rather than getting people healthy. So that's the underlying issue with everything. We could have prevented AIDS. We certainly could have prevented COVID. We could have prevented the opioids epidemic and any number of things in between. So I like to, whenever I have any public forum, I remind people that the best drug we have in the world is money. Money is the solution to a lot of things, and it's really badly prescribed. Some people have way too much of it, and way too many people have too little of it. If we had more equality, more equity in society, we'd be a much, much healthier society. And that could fix things much better than any medical miracle.
So when you say the best drug is money, you're basically saying that if we could address poverty, fewer people would be sick. Is that effectively what you mean?
Yeah, that's part of it. But I think that it's more profound than that. It's the less inequality there is in the world, the more fairness there is, the better people live. What matters to our health is having an income, having food on the table, a roof over our heads, an education, having social connections. Those are all the things that make us healthy. Medicine is a little bit of that comes in when those things go wrong. And if we did all those other things better, we wouldn't need as much medicine. We could do with a lot less. I'd love to see a much smaller sickness care system in Canada and a lot bigger social safety net.
Yeah. And I think some people have made the argument, and I know studies have been done, but and to use that sort of classic phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'm sure in dollar terms, if we were, that people will say, well, a stronger social safety net's going to cost a lot of money, but our healthcare system costs a lot of money, right? So presumably, if we were investing more in looking after people before they got sick, then they'd be less likely to become an expense to the system on the other end, right?
Absolutely. And take an example like early childhood education, investing in that. Every dollar you invest in early childhood education saves about $6 in health costs. There's a real direct measurable impact, and it's a huge one. And it's more than an ounce to a pound. Translation, it's actually much more powerful than that in many, many areas. And we're very short-sighted, I think, in a lot of our public policies.
Yeah. And what do you think? What you're describing seems to me to be an example of being very reactive rather than proactive about everything. What's at the heart of that? Is there some sort of political reality that dictates that? Is it a lack of foresight? Like why? Because I imagine that many people intellectually would understand the argument that you're making, and yet there isn't the willpower to get it done.
Yeah, I don't think there's a simple explanation to it. I think some of it is political, a little bit of our political cycle. It's best to be reactive, to act in the short term, you get rewarded for that. I think people don't like to think about the long term. Nobody ever wants to think they're going to be sick or old or, not have their autonomy anymore. So we really don't think about that. We don't think when we go to school, we don't think of the value of an education, that it's going to make you less likely to have dementia at 75. We don't think about that. We live in the present for better or worse. So I think it's up to our institutions, it's all up to our policymakers to do that thinking for us and make it easier for people to embrace that. So it's a mixture of things. I don't think anybody is evil or ill-intentioned. It's just, it's a little bit human nature, unfortunately.
Yeah, I find that interesting because it suggests to me that we are not designed to play the long game, right? That our horizons are not long enough, and that maybe there's something sort of evolutionary or adaptive about that, because by and large throughout the history of our species, we weren't thinking about saving for our retirement. We were thinking about getting food for the next few days and protecting ourselves from risk. So because of that, maybe on some level, we're not wired to think in terms of 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 50 years down the road.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is just because this is the recent history. Living a long time is a relatively new thing in the world. Until the end of Second World War, life expectancy, even in a wealthy country like Canada, was still only 67. Why is the retirement age 65? Like, people never think about those fundamental issues, right? This is the kind of thing, because I'm curious. I'm like, well, why is it 65? Well, it's 65 because we expected most people to be dead by the time they got their pension, right? They're all going to die by 67. So it's a good thing. We'll take care of you after you retire, give you a couple of good years, but then you're done. Nobody ever thought that a pension plan would have to last 40 years. And we haven't adapted to that. And it's the same with our healthcare system. We haven't adapted to the reality of we don't need acute care anymore. We need chronic care. You used to, in the 1950s, when our system was created, it was an acute care system. If you went into the hospital, chances are you came out the back door in a box, right? You usually go to hospital to die. That's not what happens anymore. Now you enter the health system and you're there for 30 or 40 years being taken care of in different ways. So we have this acute care system trying to provide chronic care. So I always say it's a round peg in a square hole every day, and we haven't fixed that alignment.
Yeah, and that leads quite well into the next, the subject of your book, obviously. And before we dive very deeply into that, that sort of lack of foresight, does that kind of drive you crazy when you see that? I mean, the fact that we are so short-sighted about things, even though there's all this evidence around us that shows we could accomplish so much more if we just went about it better.
Yeah, it is frustrating. It's frustrating we don't learn the lessons of history. It's frustrating we don't plan ahead. Just look at the baby boom. The baby boom is a classic example. It happened, a long time ago. It happened 60 years ago. It's no surprise that people were going to get older, right? And we just all of a sudden, people are old. We have an aging society. Well, how did that happen? Well, it happened over a long, long period, and we did nothing. So we are reaping the problems that we created by doing nothing.
Yeah. And COVID obviously is another example of that, because we were not adequately prepared for a pandemic, in part because I think most of us, including, and I'm not faulting anyone in particular for this. I'm just saying it includes all of us, but there weren't really any people, apart from a very small number, who were saying this poses a big threat to us, because it doesn't seem real until it happens, right?
Yeah. And again, many people have been warning us for years. We knew the big one was coming, We've known it for 100 years that we're going to be another big pandemic. But it's hard, you're right. It's hard to plan for the abstract. It's much easier to deal with the immediate issues, especially as a politician.
Yeah. And there's a so far so good kind of element to all of this too, I think. When you say the big one's coming, it makes me think of the San Andreas fault and the someday there's going to be a big earthquake in California, but they just keep building homes and the population keeps growing. And again, it's not real, it's not immediate. And so people just leave it up to chance, right?
And again, it's human nature. It's not going to happen to me. Yeah, lots of people have heart attacks, but it's never going to be me. Lots of people get cancer. It's not going to be me. Not very many people win the lottery, but it's going to be me. I'm going to win the big one. So it's human nature to think like that.
Yeah. So let's steer towards what you've written about in this new book, and obviously the pandemic is a powerful backdrop for all of this. I'm curious to know what you think about whether after the pandemic's over, we've all been vaccinated, life gets back to normal, whether we're going to heed the lessons that we've observed in the last year and what will likely end up being a 2-year immersion in the pandemic. But let's talk about what we learned in particular about how we care for seniors and other people in long-term care facilities during this pandemic and how it was such a surprise to everybody that this was going on.
Yeah, so I think to put it in some context, it's been a huge disaster, right? I don't think you can use strong enough language to explain what went wrong. We've had about almost 24,000 deaths in Canada now from COVID, and about 17,000 of those deaths were in these long-term care institutions. So it was just horrific what went on there. And not only did a lot of people die, but they died in a horrible manner, often with very little care, no palliative care, their families locked out. So you can't imagine worse circumstances. So that's, as you said, that's the backdrop. Then the question is, why did this happen? And it happened because we created the perfect environment for it to happen. We put people into large institutional settings. We put them in rooms with 3 and 4 beds. They're frail. They're very susceptible to illness. We understaffed them. There's a total lack of resources in these homes. And then when the threat came, we didn't react promptly. When COVID arrived, we knew about it in late December, January 2020. What did we do? Well, we put up the barricades around our hospitals. Hospitals did exceptionally well during COVID, but we forgot about the folks down the road who were at much, much greater risk. We talk now about this iron ring. We didn't even have a paper ring around these homes. And even though we saw it happen in Italy, we saw it happen in Spain, we still kind of went, we got to take care of our hospitals. We didn't worry about them. And we are paying the price to this day. And it's just horrible what happened in these homes.
Yeah. And why is that? Why we say that we value older people in society. We respect them. We know that's going to be us one day. If we live that long, if something doesn't happen to us in the meantime. These are members of our families, members of our communities. These are our parents and grandparents. How did we not take better care of these people?
Well, I think we do value our elders individually. So we all love our parents and our grandparents, but we have to figure out how to do it collectively. And we do a terrible job collectively. Our public policies are inherently ageist, to a perverse degree. A lot of this is historical. So this whole, I talk in my book about this system it didn't emerge from the health system. It emerged from the penal system. It emerged from poverty laws. We're going to take care of you only because if we don't, you're going to kind of die in the street and smell bad. We're going to do the least possible for you. And that's how these systems were created. People had to work for their meager rations. Didn't matter how old they were, how rickety they were. And that's what this system was. Right into the 1960s in Ontario, you could still be punished. If you were in a long-term care home and you didn't do your chores, you didn't get your supper. You could be locked in the basement for misbehaving. They were like prisons. People wore uniforms like prisoners do. This is in my lifetime. People don't, it started in the 1600s, but people don't realize how ingrained this attitude is of treating people as unworthy and treating older people who don't have money as unworthy. And the second part of it is just We have this obsession in society about the economy, about money. And once you stop being an earning member of society, you kind of become a second-class citizen, right? That retirement is a nice thing in theory, but what all our public policies tell us is when you retire, you're a parasite. You're a taker. You're not a giver anymore. And we're going to give you the least possible because, if you didn't save enough on your own, we're not going to take care of you. That is what our policies say. They don't say it in as many words, but they say it in actions. And I don't think people don't step back and think about that stuff too often.
Yeah, and look, I thought one of the great revelations of your book was that connection to the penal system, that's sort of where the concept of long-term care and retirement care on a public basis, where that arose. And the more I think about it, the more parallels I can see there. I mean, I'd never noticed it before, but it is very much treating the people who are living in these homes and facilities as a burden on society, similar to someone who has been imprisoned, incarcerated for committing a crime, treating them as a burden that we've all got to kind of deal with, as opposed to just a phase of their lives where they are drawing on a system that they've paid into in a lot of cases for many years.
Yeah. And that's, if you go into these homes, if you've experienced them, they're very regimented. It is like prison. You have to eat at a certain time. We do stuff to you. We don't do what you want. Now it's time to change you. Now it's time to bathe you. We tell you what to do. There are rules and you have to follow them. They're not homes by any stretch of the imagination. They're institutions. And I think that's one of the big changes is we should essentially recognize people are going to be old and frail, and these are going to be their final years. So to me, their final years should be spent in dignity. We should figure what can make you happiest at this point of your life. You don't have much life left. That's why you need 24/7 care. So how can we make that as good as possible? And we have the exact opposite reaction. We treat people horribly in their final years.
Yeah, and it's almost like, I know that at a certain point, some people reach they're at a stage in life where it's harder for them to take care of themselves, or in some cases they can't do anything to take care of themselves. But when it's a child, when you have an infant or a toddler, or you have a child with even perhaps a disability who requires extra care, there's this huge emphasis on accommodation and support. And I'm not sure that we have the same mentality when it comes to older people. They almost, I think, institutionally and systematically, we treat them almost like they've overstayed their welcome, right?
Yeah, it's very different. And, that parallel is often made. Imagine if 17,000 kids had died in daycare. The people would be with pitchforks heading to Parliament Hill. There'd be no question. And with older people, we're like, oh, well, they're going to die anyhow. Like, that's one of the most reprehensible things I've heard during COVID is people tell me, well, they're going to die anyhow. And I'm like, well, yeah, we're all going to die eventually, but that doesn't mean we should all die today. And it doesn't mean we should die in horrific circumstances of neglect. So we have to treat people well, regardless of their ability, regardless of their age. And that has to be the fundamental philosophical change, I think. And to me, I talk about that a lot in the book, is I think what needs to change is our attitude. Once we say we value our elders, we want them to be part of our community. Once we decide that we want everyone treated like our own grandmother, then everything else is pretty simple. Then it's just it's plumbing. Once you decide what the sink you're going to build, then it's easy. But we have to decide what is our philosophy, and then we have to implement.
When you talk like that, it almost sounds to me like some of the human rights movements that you've covered yourself before, like the gay rights movement, something like that, that there genuinely is a need for seniors to have someone fight for their human rights because they're not given the same rights and privileges. They're not treated the same way. They are, as you said earlier, treated like second-class citizens. They're in a different category, right?
This is absolutely a rights issue. I just yesterday was doing a panel on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Older Persons. That's something that's in the works. We've had an international declaration on the rights of children for 30 years now, but we don't have it at the other end of the spectrum. And you're right, people are not only they're neglected. In the book, I call it our practice elder apartheid. We take people once you become old and we remove you from society. We put you in these homes. We have 400,000 people in institutional care in Canada. We put you in these homes, you essentially lose your citizenship. You don't have any agency. You're often sitting in this building by the highway, but you're out of sight, out of mind, out of rights, out of dignity. That's what we do to people. That is fundamentally a rights issue.
So there's a couple of things at play there. And actually, before we get into that, does that scare you? It scares me when you talk about it. I don't want to end up there, right? I mean, how does that make you feel having observed this?
It should scare all of us. There's no question. I've had parents go through this system. I'm no spring chicken. You can tell by the color of my hair. We're all going there. Hopefully we'll all get really old. I think one of the worst underlying ageist premises in this is when we always talk about the silver tsunami and old people are going to bankrupt the system. To me, the fact that our fastest growing demographic is 100-year-olds, we should be celebrating that. That's a miracle of science and of social policy, and we should be celebrating that. People, I know a lot of healthy 100-year-olds, because of my work. I know 90-year-olds who are in bands and who tour the world on their sailboats and stuff. This should be our reality. And when it isn't, when we do need care, well, then we should take really good care of people who don't have that privilege.
So is there an element of this that, and I hate to state it in these crass terms, but there must be an explanation for it on this level, to some extent, that there are some very inconvenient truths here for younger people that, I think we all sort of go through this thing in life where, when you're a kid, you don't realize that your grandparents were ever, your age, right? And that it's almost like the elderly are a different species. They're a different group of people. They're not us in the future. They're just a different group of people. And it's inconvenient for us to confront the fact that they are us, just getting there before us, and that we just don't prioritize them. We don't put the resources behind it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I think a lot of it is even, I'm getting old, it's self-inflicted. None of us ever want to admit we're going to lose autonomy or lose skills. Well, I can run. Why do I have to worry about being 90? I'm still going to be running when I'm 90. Maybe that's a fantasy, but maybe it's true. But I think a lot of it is just self-denial. And why do we deny aging? We deny aging because aging is seen as a negative. Nobody wants to be there, right? So we do this removal. We don't want to deal with that. I don't ever want to be the person who loses autonomy. So I'm not going to write a will. I'm not going to have a DNR. I'm not going to talk to my kids about what happens if I have a stroke and need to be in an institution. This is all stuff we have to talk about much more openly. And that's one of the things I really hope in the book, I say the most important conversation we can have about this is at the dinner table or at the breakfast table. Just talk to your kids. What happens? Talk to your spouse. What happens if I have a stroke tomorrow or if I have dementia? Here's how I want to be treated. Here's where I want to go. He makes it so much easier. There's so many caregivers out there who are thrust into this in a moment of crisis, and they don't know what to do because they've never had the talk. We have the sex talk with kids when they're young. We have to have the sex talk. We have to have the talk. Doesn't necessarily have to be about sex. There's lots of sex in nursing homes, thankfully. But we have to have that talk about how do you want to be treated at a certain point.
Yeah. And so before we talk about kind of the broader institutional societal solutions, and I know you look at examples in other countries, what advice do you have for individuals? Because this is, of course, playing out on a very broad landscape as a society, and we can get into kind of, we've already talked about why it's not a priority, how it should be, all of that. But within families and as individuals, what do we need to confront? What do we need to think about in terms of our own lives and the lives of our family members?
We have to do what I just said. We have to talk about what's the worst case scenario and what's the best case scenario. The best case scenario is frightening sometimes too. What happens if I live to 90 and I don't have my RSP is only good till I'm 80? So there are lots of things we have to talk about. The best case, the worst case, what happens if I have a severe disability, if I have dementia? And you have to have a plan. We often, we do a lot more planning for our homes, for our cars, than we do about ourselves. I know my car is going to last 5 years. I got to put money aside so I can buy a new car in 4, right? Because I don't want to be dealing with we have to do that with us as human beings. What am I going to do when I get old and rickety? And where am I going to live? Can I live in this house? It has 2 stories of stairs. I love this house, but what am I going to do? Should I move now? These are all things that it's about ensuring, finding ways of ensuring we can stay in the community as long as possible. To me, that's the goal. Our default setting about all public policy, all individual decisions was, how can I stay in society as long as humanly possible?
Yeah, that's such a great point. As an aside, I think, there are so many ways in which we treat our cars better than we treat our bodies, even in terms of the fuel we put in them and all kinds of things. We could have a whole separate conversation about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, we change the oil regularly. We don't do that maintenance of ourselves.
Yeah. I think what you're saying, I've just recently been through a financial planning exercise where, you run the scenarios. If you live to be this age, if you live to be that age, how much money you're going to have. And you put in some certain assumptions about what it's going to cost to live at that time and what you're going to want to be doing. And it strikes me that even in that exercise, you make certain assumptions like, I'm going to be super healthy and traveling, and I'm going to need I'm going to need money for these cruises and round the world trips and all of that. But you're not really thinking about, what if life goes in a different direction? What if I live to be 100, but the last 15 years of my life, I need a lot of serious healthcare, right?
Yeah. And, in Canada, we love our Medicare system, right? It's a beloved institution. And we have this assumption it's going to take care of us. We're going to be taken care of when we're old. But our acute needs are going to be taken care of. If we're in the hospital, if we need a doctor care, Medicare does a good job of that. But once you're out of that acute, immediate need, you fall off a cliff. Like one of the biggest shocks to people is finding out how much long-term care costs or how much home care costs. Long-term care costs anywhere from $1,200 to $15,000 a month, depending on what the quality of your surroundings, your needs. Home care can be $3,000 a month. If you get 3 hours of care a day, that translates to $3,000 a month. This is not petty cash. This is a mortgage. And we don't think of it in those terms.
So let's talk about how we can solve this issue more broadly and some of the examples you looked at. You mentioned something earlier, which I think is really relevant, is even just something like the number of people that are in a room. I know that as future hospitals are being planned and built, that they're going to move away from even having 4 people in a room in a hospital setting, let alone a long-term care facility. Obviously, that was born out of some practical cost-saving measure and not based on any thought process about what was healthiest for the patients. Infections, of course, are going to spread a lot more quickly in a shared room than in separate rooms. So that's one very simple practical example. But more broadly, what else can we do to change our approach to this?
Well, I think it's a few things. I think the first one is having this philosophy. Elders matter. We want them in the community. You have that starting point. So then what does the policy become? The policy becomes invest a lot more in home care, ensure that people who just need little things, that they stay home. It's always shocking to me how really banal things result in people going into institutions. They can't shop anymore. They can't shovel their walks. They have too many stairs. All this stuff is fixable at very, very low cost. And you keep people in their circle. You keep them away from being isolated. So there's real benefits to doing things differently. So let's ensure that only the people who need to be in an institution are there. So that takes off a big chunk off the top. And then when you do need institutional care, and many people do, I had 2 parents with dementia, et cetera. They needed that 24/7 oversight. But let's not put them in prisons. Let's put them in homes that actually look like homes. So smaller institutions, 1 bum per toilet. You have your own room. This is your home. You're not going to prison, so you should have your own room. You should be able to decide when you eat. You don't have to eat at 6 a.m. because that's when the gruel is being served. You eat when you want, and you eat whatever you want. Maybe you want to eat your chapati in the morning or whatever. You eat whatever. that's what we have to do. And the countries that do it well, that's how they deliver care. They deliver it in a person-centered manner, not in an assembly line manner.
Something else you brought to light, which I didn't fully understand until then, is just that there's in other countries there's more integration of these communities, of these homes into the community, right? Rather than that's another thing that kind of mirrors the prison system, is just that we tend to put these homes separate and distinct on a separate piece of land as opposed to being connected to a neighborhood, right?
Yeah, I think that's really an essential component is integration. We put these homes in the suburb or by the highways because land is cheap, so it's all about money. If you go to Nordic countries, for example, a care home is always attached to a school or to a daycare. And again, it's a philosophical issue. People who are old should be seen. They should be seen as being part of society. We should, given the number of people with dementia in our country, we should see people with dementia every single day, but we don't. We shunt them off invisible, and we should see them in our society, and we should adapt to it and realize, oh, this is normal. This is normal. A lot of us are going to experience this. Let's integrate people. We don't need to change society much to make people accept it.
Yeah. And again, that to me connects back to that basic human rights aspect of it, that if people are not visible, it's a lot easier to deny them their rights. And we've been doing that with, segregation. We've been doing that with not allowing gay rights, forcing that underground historically. And now we're doing it with the elderly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The same issues, the human rights issues are the same across many, many of these demographics, and the elders are just one example of this.
Do you think there is an element to this that we are in Canada sometimes complacent about our healthcare because we buy into the mythology that we have the best system in the world? Is that part of this?
I think it's partly that. I think the bigger one that always irks me is this notion that, well, it's free. It's free, so I guess we can accept it's kind of second rate, right? Because, well, if it would be too costly, it would be a burden on us all. And that to me is the worst mythology of all, that because things are publicly funded, that they have to be second rate. That isn't true, and that's not true in most of the world. And we also have a lot less publicly funded care than we think. I always say, we have the least universal healthcare system in the world. And long-term care is an example of that. If I go all over Europe, long-term care is funded the same way the hospital is funded. Not necessarily 100%, it is in Canada, but maybe 90% or 80%. And it's a seamless transition. It's actually a system. We don't have a system in Canada. We have all these silos, and the cliff is much steeper for some of them, especially things like long-term care.
Yeah, that's a great point. Two great points. In fact, I think you're totally right about the idea that we sort of, accept a different level of care because it's free, even though we are paying for it. So it isn't free. It's just a different way of paying. And so we almost have this mentality like, well, don't complain about it, or we're going to end up with the American system, and then we'll all be worse off. So keep your mouth shut. And then, as you say, it isn't even universal. Dental care, prescription drugs, all these things are not paid for by the system. And yet we sort of act as though everything's covered when it isn't. It can still be very expensive.
Yeah. And I think, that's always the argument, right? Whenever I talk about the book, people say, well, yeah, these are great ideas, but they cost too much. And my answer is always, well, we're paying for them now. We're paying a lot amount of money, and we're doing it we're not getting value for money. So it's, you can pay from your right pocket. That can be your tax dollars, or you can pay from your left pocket, your own money. But we're going to pay. We're going to pay one way or another. So we have to figure out how to get a system that's more equitable. And the way to do it is to have public input to ensure that we have good homes and we have standards, et cetera. And is there going to be some private money? Almost certainly. Some people are going to have slightly different care, but we have to raise the bar on what is the minimum standard. Everyone should expect a certain level of care, as they do in our hospitals. They should expect the same thing in long-term care and home care, et cetera. And we just are not ensuring the floor. There's no ceiling here, but we don't have a good floor either.
All right. I'm going to give you unlimited power, André, to change the healthcare system. What are three or four, whatever number you want? What steps would you take? What are the most important things that you would, if you could just wave a magic wand and change healthcare, what would you do?
I think the first thing I do is just get people to talk about what we talked on earlier about the social determinants of health. Let's figure out where we should be spending our money most wisely. So let's stop making the distinction between sickness care and health care. We spend way too much money on institutions and fixing people. So let's spend on keeping people healthy. So that'd be the first thing I do. The federal government recently announced lots of money for childcare. I think that's brilliant. I think that's going to pay off in spades. But we have to do some catching up at the other end of the spectrum. So I would like to see a similar investment in elder care to keep people in the community. And all these things will have payoffs. They'll result in less acute care. So that would be a big one. I said, let's think about health differently, make it an all of government approach. So that would be a big one. On a practical level, if you ask me what to do about fixing elder care today, I would do two things. I would say choice. Choice is really important. People should have the ability to stay in the community to a reasonable amount of time, and you can find a reasonable cap. A country like Britain says you can spend as much on home care as the equivalent of what you would spend on an institution. So we spend roughly $200 a day in public money to keep people in an institution. There's no reason we couldn't tomorrow say any one of those people could spend $200 a day at home. That would maybe remove 30% of people from home. So they don't need to be there, zero cost.
Right.
So that's just an example of getting value for money and giving people choice. And then you have to do the plumbing, the practical grunt work of fixing policy. And that begins with people. Healthcare is all about people caring for people. This sector, elder care, is under-resourced. It's understaffed dramatically. So I would really work on ensuring standards of care. Let's guarantee everyone has a certain level of need, we guarantee them a minimum of 4 hours of care daily, whether it's at home, whether it's an institution. Once you do that, you really start having a good base of ensuring that people are treated in a dignified fashion. So you do those 3 levels of things, and our health system would be dramatically better at not a much greater cost. Because I know people are obsessed about money, so I always put in the money.
Sure. Yeah. And you were originally going to study business, right? So it all comes back to that. But that first point you made, I keep coming back to that because I think there is a fallacy around the idea. There are obviously there is an element of randomness and genetics in terms of how our lives play out and the health risks that we encounter. But I think in a sort of societal sense, there are some very predictable outcomes, right? So if you look at a community where there's a lot of poverty, there are going to be certain health outcomes that result from that. So we can't just pretend that those things are happening independent of the circumstances. And if we change those circumstances, we can get different outcomes. But we seem to be reluctant to acknowledge that, right?
Right. Yeah, and you're right. And all of these things are studied. You can measure to almost a perfect degree what happens if a child doesn't get education. We know how many lives a year lost, how much more costly their healthcare will be. We know all this stuff. We have all the actuarial info, and we just don't act on it. So I think these fundamental things we have to pay a lot more attention to. The other thing is I think we have to stop romanticizing things like Medicare. I think one of the biggest problems with Medicare, we just see it as this glorious thing. It's what defines us as Canadians. I hate that. I always say, I don't want to be defined by an insurance policy. So we have to think of it in cold, hard facts. This is an insurance policy. You're going to pay into it. And just like your house insurance, you should hope that you never need it. My house burned down. I needed my insurance, but I really wish it had never burned down. And I feel the same about my health. I happily pay my taxes, and I hope I never have to cash it in. But if I do, I want to be treated decently, just like I was by my insurance company. They rebuilt my house. If I get rickety, I want people to take care of me. Think of it in practical terms. This is insurance. Here's how much we need to invest. Here's what we can pay back. And I think we'd have a better system if we were less starry-eyed about it.
Absolutely. No, it's the healthcare system in Canada is too sacred, right? You're not allowed to criticize it. And because of that, we ignore, there are all these blind spots about it, right?
Yeah.
Did your house actually burn down?
Yeah, just a few years back.
Oh, wow.
Thankfully, no one hurt. It was just material, and the insurance company was great, which Medicare was as responsible.
So that's a great point. Yeah. Just to wrap up on a few other thoughts, and thank you for all the work you've done on that particular topic. I do think it is vitally, vitally important. What impact has covering healthcare and health had on how you approach life and how you approach your own health?
I think people often ask me this, and I think it's kind of paradoxical. I'm kind of like laissez-faire more than people think. And I think a lot of it we get to in journalism, we often meet people in the worst circumstances of their life. Like you meet people, young people dying of cancer, people with horrific genetic illnesses that only one person in the world has. So you meet kind of people in the worst circumstances of all. And you just see how amazing many of them are and how philosophical and how they deal with things. And it just makes me, I often go home after these stories where I meet people like this and I'm like, what right do I have to complain about anything? Why should I? And the other thing is I don't get too caught up in the, I call it the, kind of the health pornography, if I eat blueberries, it's going to give me better this. So I kind of just go with the flow. I eat whatever, I do my running because I enjoy it. And I don't stress the little things. So I think that's the big lesson I learned in healthcare is we're pretty adaptable beasts as humans. And if we take relatively good care of ourselves, if we think of caring for others, if we pay more attention to like investing in equity in society, if we're all better off, we're going to be better off individually as well.
Yeah, and I think, when you say that, I find it interesting because there's, I have this sort of, struggle with the fact that there are times when people say we just have to give people more information and then they'll make better choices. And of course, that isn't the case, right? We wouldn't have an obesity problem in our society if you just had to give people more information. There's there's all kinds of other factors that are at play there. And yet people have this sort of susceptibility to buy into, whatever Dr. Oz is saying about the super magic food or whatever. So we're sort of, we have this tendency to kind of fixate on the small things when we miss the point of the bigger stuff, right? And if you get the bigger stuff right, you don't need the smaller things in a way, right?
Right. And I think we have to remember that a lot of us have the privilege of worrying about the little stuff, and that's what
True.
It is, privilege. I get angry when people say, oh, look at that person, he's smoking. They're horrible. Well, put yourself in their shoes for a day or a month. If you're living in poverty, et cetera, you don't have food on the table, nicotine is going to stop you from being hungry. There are reasons that people smoke. Maybe they have mental illness. I think a big lesson I've learned early on in healthcare, because I started covering AIDS, is don't judge people. Understand why they're doing things. Don't judge them. I've been a long-term proponent of harm reduction before it was popular because of that. Meet people where they are, help them be as healthy as possible, but don't judge them. None of us is perfect. A lot of people don't have the privilege to be there, to be able to make these choices.
Yeah. Great point. So let's come back to a couple of very quick things. Beekeeping. When did you get into that? What was the appeal? Tell me more.
A quirky little thing. My kids went to school with some high school with some kids who started a little beekeeping company, and they were selling these beehives. And to support these young people, I had purchased one of these, and then I got into it. Harvested my own honey. It made all my Christmas presents. I got 10, 20 pounds of honey from a single hive every year, and it was fun. And it was also fun in an urban environment. You realize that having urban flowers, etc. I had a cherry tree, and the bees were really good for the cherries. It just made you feel more part of nature in a big city.
Cool. And I understand, I read this in a story about you, but I wanted to check if this was the case, that there was a time when you were traveling across the country by train and you actually got off the train, all your stuff was still on the train and the train left without you. And yet it all worked out. Can you share that story?
Yeah, it sounds like a metaphor for life. But yes, when I was young, I traveled across the country by train. I still love trains. I take them whenever I can. But yeah, I got off at a stop with a couple of people I had met, and the train left, and we spent a little too much time in town. Good example of how do you adjust in life. We grabbed a taxi that was outside the train station, and the guy was local. I don't know, where rural Manitoba or something. And he knew where the next crossing was, and he sped ahead. And we are at the crossing, and we waved down the train, and they actually stopped. This was long before we worried about terrorism, and they actually stopped the train. And the conductor made a show of it to bring down little step for us, and greeted us aboard, and then promptly chewed us out for half an hour for being idiots. But interesting little story, and a lesson learned to. When the train whistle, the first train whistle goes, go running back. Don't wait to hear the all aboard from a block away.
Yeah. Wow. What a nice little story, though, about how, you were able to get back on the train. I'm not sure if it would, be the same today. There's a lot of other circumstances that come into play, but in a different time, people were helpful, people were accommodating. Things were a little less structured. There were a lot fewer rules, maybe, but
and I think a good story about how Canadians are. Canadians figure stuff out. The taxi driver figured it out. He didn't say, "Oh boy, you're shit out of luck." He figured it out. And I think there's still a lot of that to this day.
Yeah. Well, I hope we can figure out some of the challenges that you've identified about how we look after the elderly in our society. It's a huge issue, and I'm grateful to you for having exposed it and discussed it so thoroughly and brought it forward as something that all Canadians should address. And I hope it is something that we carry with us out of this pandemic. And I hope we don't, there's a tendency in a time of crisis to say, "Oh, I've learned my lesson. I've learned my lesson. I'll never let that happen again." But then once it's over, we kind of forget all those lessons and life just goes back to normal. I hope that's not the case with this.
Yeah, we have very short memories institutionally, and I hope in this case that the memories of the horrors that occurred in elder care linger, and that they force and provoke some really long overdue change.
Great spending time with you. Thank you again for the work that you've done on this story and so many others. It's really, you've played such an important role in our country covering these really, really critical issues. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thanks, Mark, and stay well.
I really like that point about how we spend all of our time on sickness care rather than health care, and how money is the best drug in the world, but we prescribe it very, very badly. So once again, thank you to André Picard for joining us on Digging Deep. His book is titled Neglected No More: The Urgent Need to Improve the Lives of Canada's Elders in the Wake of the Pandemic. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of Digging Deep, please review it and share it with others. That's going to help us produce more great episodes. And if you want to keep digging deep into topics and lessons like this, if you want to see the show notes or subscribe to our weekly newsletter or read my daily blog, you can do all of that at letsdigdeep.com. Give it a try. letsdigdeep.com. And get ready for more great stories and powerful lessons from wonderful people on the next edition of Digging Deep. Thanks for listening.